My hope is that Christians will just realize confronting racism, confronting any sort of bias you have, this is just part of what it means to follow Jesus in the modern world. And there really is no other way to follow Jesus if you're not willing to love your black and brown and gay and lesbian and transgender neighbors as yourself. You can disagree. I'm not even here to debate the theology or ideology. I'm just saying, are you going to help them get ahead, a fair shot in society like you and your family have? If not, you're not following Jesus, quite literally.
You know, I used to be pissed off when I saw dog owners let their dogs relieve themselves and then not clean it up. And I saw this happen many times in a neighborhood where we're told to clean this up. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense until I became a dog owner, a female dog owner. And then I realized all of these owners that I was judging, they were just letting their female dogs pee. And then they moved on about their business. So I apologize to girl dog owners as well as bitches out there that I've been judging for your squatting. I apologize. Context is important, man. We will be starting our PWNA raffle next week. So some of you existing patrons, if you are in the $8 tier of the Bear With community, which is basically Pastor With No Answers patrons, if you are in the $8 tier, you can, for this month only, increase to the $20 tier. Go ahead and get your t-shirt, Pastor With No Answers cooking spices. Yes, that exists. T-shirt, sticker, all of that. Just for this month, get all that stuff sent to your mailbox, and then you can go back down to the $8 tier, but you got all that PWNA loot. For those of you that want to just support what I do, but may not want to join the Bear With community, it's an online community version of Pastor With No Answers podcast. Some people, they want to become a patron of the podcast and skip all the community part. A lot of these perks are based around community. Thus, these perks may change your life, my friend. But you can go to the show notes. So the raffle that I'm talking about, basically there's different ways you can go about this. First of all, the show notes, go to the raffle page. You can Venmo any dollar amount, and for every dollar you Venmo, you get a raffle ticket. You can also become a member of the Bear With community just for a month. If you're a $20 Bear With community member, then you have 20 raffle tickets just for the month. Cancel it right afterwards. We've got a lot of stuff that we are raffling off, including my old bass guitar that played in the first Emery show, bunch of signed copies of Fundamentalist, my book on my mental illness mixed with legalism, and was a recipe for disaster. We got a box of unopened packs of soccer cards from the early 1990s. A few teas from my collection. We also have the Pastor With No Answers cooking spice. You got to check the spices out. If you sprinkle it on your food, you don't have to pray for your food. That's a big time saver, and it tastes good. So we will be raffling some of those off. T-shirts. We're going to have a fun time over the next 6 weeks or so announcing winners. Love for you to join it. Would love for you to just join our community here in June. We are actually getting a bunch of Christians together, some affirming of the LGBTQ community and some unaffirming people who are interested in engaging because they want to learn. They're full of love. They want to hear other people to listen. Hey, that's what love is all about. So I'll get word out. Anyone that's interested can watch this conversation take place, but the members of the Bear With community will be able to engage in it. So I'd love for you to join the Bear With community. Check everything out in the show notes. Love you guys. Here's Brandon Robertson. He is family member of this podcast, and for good reason. The dude is a radical lover and disciple, literally, of Jesus. Love it. Love him. Love you. Out. You kind of know the drill. Can I call you a friend of the show? You're a friend of the show. You're family now. Family now. It's funny. I wasn't going to mention this because, like, I know it's it's interesting that you said this. You spent some time with a community group that I'm a part of, and you had mentioned how this is your first book that's not about gay stuff. And those aren't your exact words, but it was funny because as I was thinking about talking to you before hanging out, I was like, every single time you and I have talked, it has been about that. And it's like, I'm not going to mention anything, but when you did, it sounds like congratulations is in order on your first non-gay theology book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I started off my first book. I tried to write my first book, Nomad, and not include sexuality, but it was right after I came out, and literally the publishers made me go back and write about gay stuff.
Wow.
And so literally I've done 7 books since then, and all of them have had to have sexuality at their core. So this is really the first one, and I'm glad to only mention it briefly in this book. So.
Yeah, that's cool. It almost, I was thinking about a comparison, and this may be more my generation, but it's like Jim Carrey in his first serious movie. It's like, oh, he can do this too. And I was like, of course Brandon can write about everything. And it's neat because I even, as someone that follows you, I was even thinking, hey, that dude is going to turn the corner soon, and he's not going to be known as the gay anything. He's just going to be teacher, reverend. And I think that's probably what you want to be known for, is just a guy that cares about people and wants to teach God's word.
I hope. Yes, that's exactly what I want to be. And yeah, I keep finding myself drawn back into this conversation. It never goes away, but I'm grateful for whatever opportunities I have to speak to people. So
filled to be emptied. I have had a Pentecostal upbringing, brother. We were taught to be filled to be filled. And it is, gosh, isn't it crazy how you just start to see the clarity of things that it feels like the church still hasn't figured out. And one of them, and sometimes I get into these grandpa kicks where I tell the same story over and over, and then it goes away for a while. But my listeners have probably heard me talk about a dear friend of mine whose son passed away. So he passed away. He was 40 years old. And me, as not only her friend, but as a pastor in her life, was there for her. And I kept hearing people say, be strong, be strong, be strong. Don't let this get you. I'm like, the woman just lost her son. And as Christians, that's what you've got for her. And it really makes you take a double take. Like, we are missing the boat on all of this. Yeah. And I suspect that's kind of the direction that your book is going in, having not read it yet. Am I on to something?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So this book, we talk about it through the lens of privilege, and that was kind of the cultural hook for me writing the book. But the book isn't, I do talk a lot about privilege, but the real heart of it is, let's try to articulate what it means to actually be a Christian in the modern world. It's kind of my manifesto on what I think it means to follow Jesus. And you're exactly right. So much of Christianity, especially the kinds that we've come from, evangelical, Pentecostal, all of that background, is so focused on, like you said earlier, filled to be filled. It's about getting all the right stuff in, staying strong, enduring to the end, not wavering from your faith. And it's all about this believing the right thing, having the right attitude. That's 35% of what it means to be a Christian, if you're looking at the example of Jesus. And the way that 35% has been articulated in a lot of these places is terrible. Like you just said, I grew up in environments where I remember sitting at like 13 in the packed church of my fundamentalist Baptist church after a kid from our youth group I think he got shot, and we were at his funeral. I was weeping in the back, and my youth pastor came over to me and said, "Hey, you want to be a pastor?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You got to stop crying. You can't do this. You got to be strong."
Wow.
Have these people
you caught
never
me off
read the
guard
gospel?
Just now. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's like, read Jesus.
Right.
Jesus, the fully human person who engaged with the realities of the world and wasn't only about doctrinal certainty and walking on the rigid path. He was down in the dust and dirt with people, weeping with it when his friend died. I mean, there's just so much of Christianity today that doesn't resemble Jesus. And I'm sure so many people say this, but that's kind of been my mission for the past 10 years, is to be like, I fell in love with Jesus as a 12-year-old, and I haven't known Jesus since. So how can we get back to that?
Walk me through the theological and philosophical, like whatever came out of your heart when writing this book when it comes to privilege. And something that I have recognize it's taken me a while. It's like Joey is really hard-headed, but just the fact that I don't have to even personally think about this for myself should make me pause and question. Like if I'm someone that's wired up to say, man, there's not that big of a problem. We're all good to go now. When I hear something like when it comes to white privilege and I start to feel squirmy, I should know that there's a little bit of an issue there.
Totally. And I think that's the point. That's how, when we start to notice that we're uncomfortable around anything, we probably should be invited into a deeper journey on what's that about. But
right.
This book came out of, I was pastoring a church. I stepped into pastoring Mission Gathering Christian Church in San Diego in July of 2017, right as the Trump train was coming into town. And immediately I have this progressive community who's being, like most of the country, traumatized by what we see all of a sudden from the White House, which is so different than anything we'd ever seen in American history, at least in my lifetime. So I started having to wrestle with, okay, the Women's March is happening and Trump has assaulted women. And I have lots of traumatized women in my congregation. How do I pastor these people? And then right. Trump's racist rhetoric. And I have a lot of people of color in my community. And how do I pastor these people? And the topic of privilege continued to come up during the Trump era. And I really feel like that's when it came into our cultural consciousness. And so I was like, I don't understand white privilege, so I need to educate myself. And then I need to, as a pastor, help my community understand what this word means that they're hearing. And so I spent a couple of years really like educating myself, learning, listening to people. And then really I went back to the Bible and searched for some hook, some scripture that helped articulate privilege so that I could then go back and preach a sermon series and help my congregation walk through what this word means and what's happening in our cultural moment. Yeah. And I came to Philippians chapter 2, which has been one of my grounding scriptures forever. And it's this ancient hymn called the Kenosis hymn that Paul quotes, which articulates what Jesus did. And the line in the Kenosis hymn that stuck out to me when I was writing these sermons was, though he be in very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be exploited for his own benefit. Those words, having position, power, and privilege, but not using it for his own benefit. And then it says, but he gave it up for others, taking the form of a servant. That's privilege. It's having a position and a power. It's neutral. Privilege is not bad. It's a neutral thing. Jesus had privilege and he gave it up. Read the Gospels. He's never using his divine authority to heal himself, to bless himself, to provide for himself. It's always for others. And so I preached on that passage for, I think, 6 weeks to my community. They responded well. I said, well, maybe I should write this into a little book and see if it can help others. And what came out was not just the sermon series. There's probably 2 chapters where I really zone in on privilege. The rest of it is, like I said, this more broad manifesto about, okay, if this is the example of the Jesus we claim to follow, what does this mean about every other aspect of our spirituality and of our life? What does it mean to be filled and then to empty ourselves spiritually and all these other ways? Yeah, that's the book.
Oh man, that sounds awesome. I do want to back up for a bit. It's interesting that you identified yourself as someone with white privilege. When I think of you, I don't think of privilege, but then it occurred to me that you have very significant dual things going on in your life, as you do have a white man privilege, but then sexuality wise, you've got 2 things going on, and that's not necessarily the norm. I would say you're in a minority by having those 2 significant forces there.
Yeah. So this is precisely what people are talking about when they use the word intersectionality, right? It's that you can't just say you can't just say anybody is just privileged. Everybody experiences a lack of privilege in some aspect of their life. I think this is what we've done on more progressive circles. That's probably not helpful, is that we've overgeneralized with these identity labels. That's not always helpful. You're exactly right. And I wrestle with this in like the first chapter of the book. People told me I had white privilege, and my response was, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I grew up poor. I grew up with an abusive alcoholic father. I had no money. Nobody in my family got above a high school education, and I'm gay. And I've had to figure out how to do education and get jobs and do all of that on my own. Like, what do you mean privilege? Right. But then when you step back a little bit, just talking about race, and think and look at the statistics really. And I refer to some statistics in the book about, like, I was a straight C student. I'm not good academically. And yet I got into every college I applied to. And every grad school I applied to. And I just got done applying to a bunch of PhD programs and got accepted to most of those programs. That's not because I'm superior in my academic ability. There's something else going on there. And you can do some basic research and see, I mean, there are statistics that say if you have a Black sounding name, you're something like 50% less likely to get accepted into a college.
Really?
Now, that's obviously shifting. Those statistics are probably 10 years old. But I got into college. People gave me the benefit of the doubt because I'm white, because I come from a white evangelical background. I was applying to Christian colleges. But what happens if I was a Black man applying, coming from a Black church background? Would I have gotten accepted to Moody Bible Institute? I think there's less likelihood that I would have. Yeah. So you just see the way that these implicit biases are working on my behalf. And
you would say that that's shifting tremendously right now, or it may be that we just hear the outcries of situations that go awry, because it seems as if nowadays that's not the case. In fact, it's the opposite. Like if there's ever a moment in which someone sees where someone was treated unfairly, it's a huge outcry. And in other words, I'm kind of saying it seems like we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we're in a reactionary moment. So I think everything is heightened. And I think that makes it hard, the whole conversation hard, because everything is electrified and people are, in some sense, afraid to engage in these conversations, which is another reason I wanted to write the book and say there are ways to talk about this that aren't intimidating. And I think using Jesus language helps us to not be so intimidated by it. But you're right. I think we are moving in the right direction. I think these things take a lot of time. We're not just we have to admit, at least I have to admit, I grew up in a white context, in a white neighborhood, in a white trailer park. And so I had biases all throughout my upbringing about different kinds of people, not even just racial, but different kinds of socioeconomic status and all that. That just doesn't go away. That stuff comes in my head automatically sometimes. And that's the stuff that the broader conversation is inviting us to reflect upon, is like, why do I have that bias when it comes up? Like, can we think about that bias I have against X, Y, and Z kind of person? Is there a way to undo that and to try to get them on neutral ground in my head? Like everything, this all starts inwardly and then it expresses outwardly. And if we can deal with our own implicit biases internally and then start acting in the world to make these systems just, to make sure that Black students have an equal opportunity to get into college as a white student, that's how we're going to change the game. But that's going to take decades and decades.
When I think along these lines, or when I think about this, I have to admit that my lazy mind goes to, I can't do a whole lot. But then I think, oh, well, I at least have conversations on a podcast. And it's like I start making excuses for myself. But it's like, I think at the end of the day, I really don't know exactly what to do. But then that seems like kind of in the political arena, or when it comes to people. When it comes to a Christian, Brandon, I think is where I'm confused. It's like, wait a second, this is the part that we should not have confused here. And every time I say this, I have to talk, I want to say, I know this is easy. I'm straight, I'm white, I'm male. But it seems like that's the thing that we've got to stick together in as Christians, is not to mess the love thing up. The name of your book, for crying out loud, is the cross of Jesus Christ. Like that's how we won. That's our hope. That's why you and I, no matter what happens today, we can go to bed with a smile on our face, because we have hope that someone won. Yeah. And that someone won by emptying himself. It's like, how do we not get how in the opposite direction we see things? Right. And it feels like, and I was thinking about this, Brandon, it feels like maybe it's because I grew up in, and I'm not like an anti-American person by any means, but I grew up in a season pretty much, I saw the end of the Cold War. So I've never known a country that wasn't prosperous. And so I think that my context simply is the Americanism, the nationalism, and just that sort of leaning into how we see politics and how we see faith. That was my context growing up. And so I really feel like that was a significant part of the problem.
Yeah. You said so many good things there, but I'll say on that last thing you just said, that is the moment why so many people are outcrying or having this public outcry against privileged language, is because there are a lot of people who grew up in America, where they experienced American exceptionalism and the American dream, so to speak. And life has been pretty great. And in this moment where we're actually talking about privilege and power, and this moment where we're talking about racial injustice, as the playing field gets leveled, if you were on the mountaintop, as the mountain becomes a valley, you're going to feel like you're losing. And that's the January 6th insurrection. That is the Trump presidency. It's a lot of people feeling legitimately like things are changing and the status that we once held in this country is not going to be there anymore. And that's uncomfortable. The thing that people can't understand in that moment, or they don't seem to be able to understand, is that leveling the playing field does not mean that you're going to be at a disadvantage. It just means you're going to have to work equally as hard as everyone else to do whatever you want to do. We can come back to that, because the other thing I want to say, you talked about filled to be emptied. This is the heart of Jesus. And that's why, again, I'm so passionate about taking this conversation and rooting it in the Christian message, because this is not complex. This is nothing new. Though the language of privilege and bias and intersectionality might be new, these are gospel terms. These are gospel principles. Love your neighbor as yourself is a call to give up blessing that you have for the good of somebody who's not done anything for you, who doesn't deserve anything, but you're doing it because that's the model Jesus gave us. Right. And so it's better to talk about this, I think, in Christian audiences as filled to be emptied, as God has blessed you. How are you going to use those blessings to help those that don't have blessings have an equal shot in the world? That's the language I try to keep talking about this in. And hopefully, my hope is that Christians will just realize confronting racism, confronting any sort of bias you have, this is just part of what it means to follow Jesus in the modern world. And there really is no other way to follow Jesus if you're not willing to love your Black and brown and gay and lesbian and transgender neighbors as yourself. You can disagree. I'm not even here to debate the theology or ideology. I'm just saying, are you going to help them get ahead, a fair shot in society like you and your family have? If not, you're not following Jesus, quite literally.
But yeah, it seems like the posture that we should have, and again, this is in the territory of, I know it's easy for me to say, but I feel like the posture that we should have towards people who aren't doing a good job with this should look more like picking someone's ear off from the ground and putting it back on someone. Yeah. And I feel like that's the stuff that weirds me out a little bit. Is I'm all about directness. I feel like love has to be assertive oftentimes, but when it comes across in a very assertive point the finger and minus the love, like kind of like I just lost regard for human dignity and the fact that this is someone that God breathed life into. I think that's the tricky part for me. And I've even thought the difference possibly between anger and bitterness. Like I think, and I'd have to do the definition looking up, but I think anger would almost always be a good thing as long as you don't let it turn into bitterness, because bitterness is not good for anyone. You know, where anger, it seems like it could always be a good thing. And I think that may be what we get tripped up on, because obviously we all feel good about being angry at something that's not right. Like that feels right inside. Yeah. But when you can feel that person is also bitter, maybe it's the Holy Spirit inside of me. I'm like, that's not good. Like that's not good for anybody, including yourself.
You're absolutely right. And it's been something a lot of people haven't talked about, because there is so much anger, so much pain around a lot of these topics. But the rhetoric and the demonization of people, the not giving anybody the benefit of the doubt, I think my heartbeat has always been bridge building. It's always been like, let's not just demonize we demonize the Trump supporter, right? That's something my team on the left does all the time. And it's like, well, actually, that's never helpful. Right when Trump got elected, I was invited to some meetings where we got to sit in a room with some prominent Trump folks and some prominent not Trump folks. Yeah. And just like to have the conversation of like, how do you get to where I remember Van Jones did a TV show, and I think Oprah did one too on 60 Minutes, where they sat down right after the election with white middle-class women and asked, like, why did you support Trump? Unless we actually get the story, unless we actually understand how people get to where they're at, we're never going to be able to change hearts and minds. It's easy just to say you did something that I think is reprehensible, or you are something that I think is reprehensible, and then write people off. That's going to perpetuate the problem. If we want to confront privilege and all the other social ills in our society, we need to go to the person and understand what leads them to do the thing they do, believe what they believe, and offer them an alternative by not debating with them, but demonstrating to them why it is better to give up your privilege than it is to hold it and abuse it. I wrote this book as a white guy because I think I have a responsibility to speak to my own community and say, listen, you might not be able to receive this from other kinds of folks. Let's have an in-house discussion, white Christians, about what it means for us to have privilege. And I'll use language we all know. I'll use experiences we can all relate to. And hopefully, my hope is that that will at least open the door for people to be willing to have this conversation, to think about different ways, and then maybe to begin listening to voices that are different than me. But it has to start with empathic understanding. It has to start with, I understand where you're coming from. I don't think you're a fundamentally evil person. I just think you're caught up in a system and structure just like I am.
Right.
That is hurting people, and we need to do something about it.
Or I want to understand. I'm not there yet. I don't understand you, but I want to, because I see you as a human. Yeah. Hey, let me put you on the spot here, and because you're good at this sort of thing. What would God say if it said, "Dear American Church," just in general? What would God say, very direct and loving, to Christian America as we see it today?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard question because I probably do have a little bitterness against evangelical world. And I spend a lot of my energy still speaking very harsh words sometimes to that community. I think rightfully so, but also stuff I need to process.
But it fit right into Revelation, man. So you're in good company.
But I think the broader church, not just evangelicals, but mainline progressives, all of us, I think God is probably really frustrated with our worship of ideology. That is the idol of our day. The whole idea of the incarnation of Jesus is that God becomes a human being, and the way you understand God is through a human relationship, through a real relationship with a real human being.
Wow.
And that should be the model. That's our model. We don't talk to each other anymore. We don't listen to each other. We don't consider each other anymore on the left and on the right. And so we demonize, and that is literally destroying the world.
Yeah.
Like, that's not overspeak. Our world, our civilization is on the line right now. Our democracy is on the line because we're unwilling to actually get to know people who are different than us, even people that we think are reprehensible. That is what Jesus did. Time and time again, we find him talking to the people he should not be talking to, not because even these people are bad, but because these people have a fundamentally different ideology. Like, in our day, you're validating the other side if you talk with them. In Jesus's model, he's not validating the people he's talking about. He's engaging and understanding and learning about and offering a better way to them. And so I think God wants us to get over this worship of ideological purity and get back to, do you see the face of God in your neighbor who has a fundamentally different ideology? Maybe that's your pro-choice, liberal, feminist neighbor, or maybe that is your Trump-supporting neighbor. Maybe that is your atheist neighbor. Are you willing to get to know them, not with an agenda to convert them, not with an agenda to change their mind, but to understand them?
Yeah.
And from that, I mean, Jesus said, where two or more gathered, God is in the midst. I really think when we can come together, that's when God's Spirit works and changes both people. And so I think that's what God would say to the American church right now before we destroy ourselves.
It's interesting when I hear Christians or people critique America based on the fact that we need to be more Christian. And it's like, yes, kind of, but who do you want your country to prioritize when it comes to safety? And I'm not even talking refugees right now. Like I was thinking about the war and the invasion and how Biden talked from a perspective of, hey, I'm your president and I want you to feel safe. And regardless of what you think about Biden or whether or not he was BSing people, he saw that as important. He even said everything is going to be okay. But when you think of our country and having Christian expectations, because a Christian in my personal life, I would think, man, I really have to challenge myself to turn the other cheek and not fight back. I don't need my damn country to do that too. But is that kind of a cop-out for me as a Christian?
No, I think I do talk about this in the book at length, that Jesus was anti-empire. His whole message was, there's a division between my kingdom and the kingdom that exists ruled by Caesar. Yeah. And I'm inviting you to come be a part of my kingdom. while you live in Caesar's empire, Jesus didn't try to violently overthrow the Roman Empire. He said that you can live within this, but we're going to create a new kingdom in the midst of this one. And that doesn't mean we don't get involved politically. I think we absolutely have a moral responsibility to be involved politically as Christians. But the goal isn't to Christianize the country. Every time that has happened in history, it goes wrong. Yeah. Hello, look at Russia right now and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church who came out and said, Ukrainians are evil and Putin is doing the will of God. That's what happens when Christianity gets in bed with political power. That is what happened. Not in that extreme example, but close. Anytime we see Christian religious leaders get involved deeply with a president or a prime minister or anybody, when that privileging happens, persecution starts not for the Christians, but for everyone else. And again, during the Trump administration, like we saw a lot of people crying out because of people like Paula White, who was not pro-LGBT people not getting fired from their jobs and was not pro-women having access, forget about abortion, just to equal sexual health abilities. When you have one religious ideology ruling, that's going to exclude and marginalize and hurt other people. And that's never what we're called to do. We're called to build an alternative kingdom in the midst of this empire. We're called for the church to do the job of the church, which is to love our neighbors, sell all we have and give to the poor. None of us are doing that well, but we should be aiming towards that. The goal of Christianizing our country is a goal that didn't happen until we see Emperor Constantine declaring Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. That's never anything Jesus said. It's never anything Paul said. It's nothing you can find in the New Testament. It's always about there are two competing kingdoms. You belong to the kingdom of God first and foremost, and you need to work on building that, not transforming the kingdom of Rome, the kingdom of America, into the kingdom of God.
Yeah, and it's so weird. It's like, is the kingdom of God not good enough for you? Like, I see that as a privilege that this is my real home, and that gets to be my focus. Like, it's crazy to see people like, come on, you're missing out on this. Like, the world gets to do all of the stuff the world's going to do, and we can care and love knowing the kingdom that we're a part of, and we have a childlike faith that our team won. Like their kingdom of love is taking over this shit, man. You know, it's like, I just wish that people saw that for the beauty it is. But I'll tell you what, and this is coming from a person who was a staunch Republican for the majority of my life. They did a hell of a job by making themselves the Christian party. I mean, it was a masterful stroke of genius. And I don't know if it was strategic or not, but man, Brandon, I was convinced that you just don't vote for any other party if you're a Christian. Man, to pull something off like that, but I think people are starting to see that for what it is now. Finally, I think it's becoming more of a majority of people that are just like, come on, man, you can't trust any of these people.
Well, because, and I don't mean, it's hard not to talk about Trump. But,
no, all good, man.
Trump became the moment. I was just, there's a woman writing a book on evangelicals, and I was talking to her about this the other day, that like, why is there a moment of this evangelical movement in this particular moment of history, people leaving evangelicalism? It's because Trump was the logical conclusion to conservative Christianity and republicanism coming together. What do you get? You get literally Nikolai Carpathia from the Left Behind series. Trump literally embodies these things that evangelicals spent their whole time saying we stand against. We stand against sexual immorality. We stand against. Trump is the incarnation of that. But because he said, I privilege you, I'll give you access. I'll give you whatever you want as long as you support whatever I do. The moments that evangelical leaders were willing to sell their soul, their allegiance to a leader who was antithetical to everything they stood for, that is a moment that they revealed themselves, that this wasn't about being faithful to turning our country Christian even. It was about having access to power and privilege for their own benefit. And again, the message of the gospel is you've been filled to be emptied. Evangelicals, or I should say right-wing political evangelicals, are all about preserving as much power and privilege and cultural territory as they can. That's not the gospel. And Trump revealed Robert Jeffries and Paula White and all those folks, they're not interested in following the radical renegade rabbi from Nazareth. They were interested in being in proximity to somebody who could offer them the kingdoms of the world, which is literally what Satan tempted Jesus with. And so not to speak too harshly on that, but I think there's a difference in wanting our country to have the ethical and moral values that Jesus embodied, which I think we should all argue for. If we see our country doing things that are harming our neighbor, we should speak up and ask for political change. That doesn't mean make it Christian.
You know, it's interesting when you think about it, is it feels like, and this is Christians on both sides, Democrat and Republican. I see it more in the Republican Party just because that's where I came from. But it's interesting. It's like every election year, basically both parties, they're trying to find a king. It's like you already have your kingdom, and it's already the most important kingdom, but now you want a king also. Like, and that seems to be the posture of our hearts too. It's like we need to vote for the person that is going to do what we see as God's work. But it's crazy. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for a king, and we do that because we've blurred it with religion, and so that's just kind of what our heart does, I guess. But do you, like, is this offensive to say that you are very talented in itself and have a great important voice in itself, but because you are also in the LGBTQ community, that escalates your voice? Is that offensive though, to say
no?
Even more useful is your sexuality? I don't mean it that way. I'm just saying that there's a lot of things to be bitter about if you're in the LGBTQ community. So when someone like yourself comes along, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's unique. Let me hear from this guy.
I think I'm grateful in some sense, because you're right. I have had I always say the coming out journey, especially within evangelicalism, was the most visceral experience of dying to self and rising again. Like, I understand that language of our faith more than ever, because I literally had to die to a version of myself that I had known my whole life publicly, crucify him, and ask God, like, who can I be? Do I leave faith and just become gay because that's what my faith says I need to do, just gay or Christian? Or is there a different way? And I'd like to say I followed the Spirit and remained Christian. And the other thing is, I do think I refuse to go away. And I don't know what that is. But like, there are lots of people for the past 7 years that I've been out and doing this work who keep telling me, you need to go away. You're not a real pastor. You don't have a real voice.
Wow.
And it's like, F that. Like, I'm not like so many other people who rightfully do walk away because they don't want to deal with that stuff every day. For some reason, have some inner craziness that allows me to keep coming back and be like, hey, evangelicals, or hey, Roman Catholics, or hey, whatever. I'm going to still keep showing up as a gay person, as a Christian, as a pastor, as a theologian. And we're going to keep talking about these things. And I refuse to be silenced. I care enough about the church. I care enough about the power that Jesus's people have to transform the world. Yeah. And I'm not allowing people to tell me I can't participate in that. And I think, like you said, through my experience of being LGBT and having just a little window into what it's like to be a marginalized person, I think I understand Jesus a little bit better than perhaps those who have never had to go through cultural or social marginalization, because that is who Jesus was primarily talking to. And I want to use my experience to help others who might not have this experience understand why Jesus's message is so radical, why it's so subversive, and why we really need to take it seriously, because that's the biggest thing. Yeah. Christians don't take Jesus seriously. Yeah. And if there's one thing I want to be known for, it's Brandon kept saying, you're not following Jesus. We're not following Jesus. Let's try to follow Jesus. Let's give him and his way a shot and see what happens.
That'll preach, man. That will preach. Hey, I sometimes feel like I'm like I feel like I talk like a dumb hick on here. You can be honest. Did I say anything that was it offensive sounding? Okay. Because sometimes I'm in the middle and I'm like, this isn't sounding good, but I'm being honest and I'm trying to just learn and understand. But was any of that offensive in how I asked that?
No, I appreciate that. No, I'm part of this. I'm coming out of that myself. Like, I think we need to get over, am I using the right words? All of that stuff. It's just not helpful. It's not conducive to learning. And I think you did a great job. So